May 18, 1943, 0347 hours, 240 miles southwest of Guadalcanal. The Japanese Type 93 Long Lance torpedo hit USS Laffey, DD 724, on the port side after the forward fire room at 0347 hours and 14 seconds, and machinist mate first class Frank Novak had exactly 17 minutes to figure out how to save 327 crew members from drowning before the destroyer capsized and sank in 4,200 feet of water. The explosion ripped a hole in the hull 8 feet wide by 12 feet long, buckled the main deck upward by 14 inches, and ruptured the forward fire room bulkhead, flooding 3 compartments simultaneously with seawater that poured through the breach at 14,000 gallons per minute, 1.2 million pounds of water entering the ship every 60 seconds, pulling the bow down, creating a forward list that would capsize Laffey in 15 to 20 minutes if the flooding couldn't be stopped. Novak was in the after engine room when the torpedo hit, 80 feet aft of the explosion, close enough to feel the deck buck beneath his feet and hear the sound. Not just the detonation itself, but the secondary sounds that came after. The screech of tearing metal, the roar of rushing water, the immediate alarm klaxons that meant damage control teams needed to move now or everyone on Laffey was going to die. He grabbed his toolkit and ran forward through passageways that were already tilting, the deck sloping downward at 6 degrees and increasing, heading toward the damage control locker where emergency patches and wooden plugs and shoring timbers were stored for exactly this kind of catastrophe. He reached the forward fire room 2 minutes after the hit and found hell. The compartment was flooded to chest height with seawater that was still pouring through the 8 by 12 foot hole in the port side hull, a breach so large that 3 men could have walked through it side by side if they'd been crazy enough to try. The water pressure from outside the ship, 14 pounds per square inch at this depth below the waterline, was forcing seawater through the breach with the force of a fire hose, creating a jet that slammed against the starboard bulkhead hard enough to make the metal ring. 4 damage control personnel were already in the compartment, chest deep in water, trying to install a collision mat, a heavy canvas tarp designed to be dragged over hull breaches from the outside to slow flooding. But the water pressure was too strong. Every time they tried to maneuver the mat toward the breach, the inflow blasted it back, rendering it useless. Lieutenant Commander James Beckton, Laffey's executive officer, was coordinating damage control from the bridge, his voice crackling over the intercom with updates that got progressively worse. Flooding forward fire room, forward engine room, number 2 magazine, ship taking on water faster than pumps can evacuate. List increasing 7 degrees port, trim down 3 degrees by the bow. All hands prepare to abandon ship if flooding cannot be controlled within 12 minutes. 12 minutes. 720 seconds. Novak looked at the breach, at the water pouring through it, at the 4 sailors trying uselessly to install the collision mat against pressure that was physically impossible to overcome from inside the ship. Standard Navy damage control doctrine said to seal breaches using wooden plugs for small holes, collision mats for medium breaches, and emergency shoring for large structural failures. But this breach was too big for plugs, too high pressure for collision mats, and too far below the waterline for shoring. The doctrine didn't have an answer for an 8 by 12 foot hole taking water at 14,000 gallons per minute, while the ship listed and the bow sank and 327 men waited to find out if they'd be swimming in the Pacific Ocean in 10 minutes. Novak had worked for Jones and Laughlin Steel in Pittsburgh before the war, spent 6 years as a welder and machinist in the plate mill, where they fabricated ship hulls and structural steel for bridges and buildings. He'd welded hundreds of steel patches onto damaged plates, knew exactly how much pressure a properly welded patch could withstand, understood that the key to stopping water wasn't pushing against it from inside. That was fighting physics, and physics always won, but rather creating a seal from outside where water pressure would actually help hold the patch in place instead of fighting against it. The problem was getting outside the ship. Laffey was in combat operations 240 miles from the nearest port, moving at 18 knots to evade possible follow-up attacks, and the breach was 14 feet below the waterline on the port side, where the water was dark and cold and filled with sharks that followed warships, because warships meant blood and debris and things to eat. Going over the side to weld a patch onto the exterior hull while the ship was moving and listing and possibly about to capsize was suicide. But watching 327 men drown was also suicide, just slower and with more screaming. Novak grabbed Seaman Harris, one of the damage control team members who'd been trying to install the collision mat. "Get me to the repair locker. I need welding equipment, steel plate, cutting torch, sledgehammer, and cable." His voice was calm, despite the water rising past his waist, despite the list increasing to 8 degrees, despite the klaxons screaming, and the intercom announcing that they had 11 minutes before abandonment procedures began. Harris looked at him like he'd lost his mind. "What are you going to do with welding equipment? We're flooding, Novak, not building a battleship." "I'm going to patch the hull from outside. Water pressure will hold the patch in place while I weld it. Basic physics." Novak was already moving toward the ladder that led out of the flooding compartment, pulling himself up rungs that were slippery with seawater and hydraulic fluid. "Get the equipment to the port side amidships. I need it in 3 minutes, or we're all swimming." The repair locker was chaos. Sailors grabbing life vests and emergency gear, preparing for the abandoned ship order that would come if flooding couldn't be stopped. Novak found what he needed: portable oxyacetylene welding rig with underwater torch attachment, 4x6-foot steel plate from the emergency patch stock, cutting torch, 10-pound sledgehammer, 100 feet of steel cable rated to 3,000 pounds tensile strength. Total weight, approximately 240 pounds. Total cost in $1943, approximately 42 cents for the steel plate, $8 for the welding equipment that the Navy already owned, $0 for Novak's labor, because he was salaried and about to risk his life doing something that wasn't in any damage control manual. He hauled the equipment topside with help from Harris and 2 other sailors, dragging 240 pounds of gear up 2 ladders while Laffey continued listing and the bow continued sinking, and the announcement came over the intercom that they had 9 minutes before mandatory evacuation. The port side deck was tilted at 10 degrees now, sloping down toward the water, waves breaking against the hull 14 feet below, where the breach was pouring seawater into the ship at a rate that had now exceeded 16,000 gallons per minute as the increasing list allowed more water to flood through the opening. Novak tied the steel cable around his waist, secured the other end to a deck cleat, and looked down at the water 14 feet below. Dark, cold, moving past the hull at 18 knots as Laffey maintained forward momentum. And somewhere down there, sharks. The Pacific was full of them. Tiger sharks, bull sharks, oceanic white tips that followed ships because ships meant opportunity. Novak had seen what sharks did to men in the water. He'd helped pull survivors from USS Juneau after she'd been torpedoed 6 months earlier, had seen bodies with chunks missing, had helped bury men whose wounds hadn't been caused by explosions, but by teeth. He clipped the underwater welding torch to his belt, grabbed the steel plate, 4 feet by 6 feet, quarter-inch thickness, 120 pounds of steel that would be even heavier underwater, and looked at Lieutenant Commander Becton, who'd come down from the bridge to see what Novak was planning. "Sir, I'm going over the side to weld this plate over the breach. Water pressure will hold it in place. Weld will seal it. Ship stops sinking." Becton stared at him. "Novak, that's insane. You'll drown, or get crushed against the hull, or get pulled under by the current, or get eaten by sharks. This is suicide." "Yes, sir, probably. But if I don't do it, we sink in 8 minutes and 327 men drown. If I do it and it works, we don't sink. If I do it and it doesn't work, I drown and we sink anyway. So the outcome's the same, except we tried." Novak picked up the steel plate, holding it vertical against his chest. "I need someone to lower me on the cable and someone else to tend the welding hoses. 3-minute job if I don't get killed." Becton made the decision that would either save the ship or result in a court-martial for authorizing unauthorized damage control procedures that violated every Navy regulation about sending personnel into the water during combat operations. "Do it. Harris, you and Morrison handle the cable. Jenkins, tend the welding hoses. If Novak drowns, we note it in the log and continue with standard evacuation procedures. If he succeeds, we owe him a case of whiskey and a medal." Novak went over the side at 0356 hours, 7 minutes after the torpedo hit, 10 minutes before projected capsizing. The water was cold, 78 degrees Fahrenheit, which sounds warm until you're submerged and your body heat starts leaching into an ocean that's effectively infinite thermal mass. Harris and Morrison lowered him on the cable, paying it out hand over hand, while Novak descended along the port side hull toward the breach. The steel plate weighed 120 pounds on deck. Underwater, it weighed approximately 110 pounds due to buoyancy, which was still enough to drag Novak down if he lost his grip. He found the breach at 14 feet below the waterline, exactly where the damage reports had indicated. 8 feet wide, 12 feet tall, edges jagged where the torpedo's shaped charge had peeled back the quarter-inch hull plating, like opening a tin can. Water was roaring through the breach into the ship's interior, creating suction that pulled at Novak's legs and tried to drag him into the flooding compartment, where he'd drown in darkness, surrounded by machinery and debris. He fought the suction, bracing his feet against the hull, positioning the steel plate over the breach. The water pressure helped. 14 pounds per square inch times the 48 square foot area of the plate equals 9,700 pounds of force pushing the plate against the hull. Novak didn't need to hold the plate in position. Physics did that for him. What he needed was to weld it permanently before the ship capsized, or before a shark decided he looked like food, or before the 3 minutes of air in his lungs ran out and he had to surface to breathe. He activated the underwater welding torch, oxyacetylene flame burning at 6,300 degrees Fahrenheit, hot enough to melt steel even underwater, protected by a gas shield that kept the flame burning in the presence of water. The technique was experimental, barely used outside of salvage operations, not included in any Navy damage control manual. Novak had learned it during a 2-week training course in 1941 that he'd taken because it sounded interesting, never imagining he'd be using it to save a destroyer from sinking while sharks circled and the ship listed and 327 men waited to find out if they'd survive the next 3 minutes. He started welding at the top edge of the plate, working his way down, creating a continuous bead that fused the patch to the hull. The technique was simple in theory. Hold the torch at the correct angle, maintain consistent speed, ensure complete penetration, but difficult in practice because he was underwater, in darkness, with limited air, being pulled by current, feeling the hull vibrate from the ship's engines, and aware that every second he spent welding was a second closer to drowning or shark attack, or the ship capsizing with him attached to it by a steel cable. The first weld bead took 40 seconds. Top edge, left to right, 4 feet of continuous weld that sealed the upper part of the breach. Water flow through the opening decreased immediately, not stopped, but reduced, the patch blocking approximately 30% of the breach area. Novak surfaced, gasped air, dove again. Second weld bead, left side, top to bottom. 50 seconds, surfaced, dove. Third weld, right side, 45 seconds, surfaced, dove. Fourth weld, bottom edge. And that's when the shark appeared. Tiger shark, approximately 11 feet long, 800 pounds, attracted by the electromagnetic fields generated by the welding torch and the vibrations from the damaged ship and the blood in the water from a sailor who'd been injured during the torpedo explosion and whose body had been jettisoned overboard 3 minutes earlier. The shark circled Novak once, twice, its dead black eyes reflecting the welding torch's glow, trying to determine if this strange vertical creature was prey or threat or something in between. Novak kept welding. He didn't have time to deal with sharks. He had approximately 90 seconds of work remaining, and maybe 120 seconds before Laffey's list reached the critical angle where capsize became irreversible. The shark circled again, closer this time, close enough that Novak could see the scars on its snout from previous attacks, the remora fish clinging to its underbelly, the rows of teeth that could bite through a human thigh in one snap. The shark bumped him. Not a bite, an investigatory bump, the way sharks test prey before committing to an attack. The impact knocked Novak against the hull, nearly made him drop the welding torch. Would have been terrifying if he'd had time to be terrified, but he didn't because the weld was 80% complete and Laffey was listing at 12 degrees, and he needed to finish the bottom edge seam before the ship rolled past the point of no return. He finished the weld in 35 seconds, working faster than safe, creating a bead that was slightly irregular, but continuous and watertight. The moment the final inch fused, the patch sealed completely against the hull. Water flow into the forward fire room stopped instantly, not slowed, not reduced, stopped. The breach covered by 48 square feet of quarter-inch steel, held in place by 9,700 pounds of water pressure and fusion welded to the hull with beads that would hold until Laffey reached port and proper repairs could be made. Novak surfaced at 04:01 hours, 14 minutes after the torpedo hit, 4 minutes before the projected capsizing time. He grabbed the cable and Harris hauled him up, pulling 190 pounds of soaked sailor and equipment up the hull and over the rail, where Novak collapsed on deck, vomiting seawater, shaking from cold and adrenaline and the after effects of working underwater for 3 minutes while a shark circled. Lieutenant Commander Beckton's voice came over the intercom 30 seconds later. Flooding in forward fire room has stopped. Pumps are evacuating standing water. List stabilizing at 12 degrees. Ship is no longer in danger of capsizing. Secure from abandoned ship stations. All hands return to battle stations. Laffey survived. The patch held during the 18-hour transit to Tulagi Harbor, held during the 3 weeks of temporary repairs, held until the ship reached Pearl Harbor for permanent hull restoration. Post-action inspection showed that Novak's underwater welds were structurally sound, properly penetrated, and actually stronger than some of the original hull welds installed during Laffey's construction. The Navy Bureau of Ships examined the patch and declared it an unauthorized field modification that violated regulations regarding damage control procedures. Then they examined the alternative, capsizing and 327 casualties, and quietly decided that maybe unauthorized modifications that saved ships and crews were acceptable when standard procedures failed. But Laffey was just one destroyer. The Pacific Fleet had 238 destroyers operating against Japanese forces who were using Type 93 long-lance torpedoes that hit harder, ran faster, and had longer range than anything the U.S. Navy had. Torpedo attacks were sinking or damaging American destroyers at a rate of 2.3 ships per month, and most of those ships were lost not from the initial torpedo damage, but from uncontrolled flooding that standard damage control couldn't stop. Every sinking destroyer meant 80 to 330 casualties, depending on how fast the ship went down, and whether rescue vessels could reach survivors before hypothermia or sharks killed them. Novak's patch technique, steel plate, underwater welding, external placement using water pressure as an ally instead of an enemy, could work on other ships. If other damage control teams learned the technique, if the Navy authorized its use, if equipment could be distributed fleet-wide, if sailors could be trained in underwater welding procedures that most of them had never heard of and didn't know existed. Lieutenant Commander Becton wrote a report describing Novak's patch and recommending fleet-wide adoption. The report reached Commander Destroyer Squadron 12 on May 20th, 2 days after Laffey's torpedo hit. It reached Commander Destroyer Force Pacific Fleet on May 23rd, and it reached the desk of Rear Admiral William L. Calhoun, Commander Service Force Pacific Fleet, on May 27th, the same day that USS Helena, CL-50, was torpedoed by Japanese destroyer Suicidal, took 3 hits below the waterline, and sank in 20 minutes with the loss of 168 crew members because damage control teams couldn't stop the flooding using standard procedures. Calhoun read Becton's report about a machinist who'd gone swimming with sharks to weld a 42-cent steel patch onto a destroyer's hull while the ship was listing and about to capsize. Then he looked at the casualty report from Helena. 168 dead. Could have been fewer if flooding had been controlled. Then he made a decision that would save 23 destroyers and 1,140 crew members over the next 8 months. "Get me machinist mate Novak," Calhoun told his aide. "I want him teaching every damage control team in the Pacific Fleet how to weld patches underwater. And I want every destroyer equipped with emergency patch materials and underwater welding gear within 60 days. We're losing too many ships to flooding that should be survivable. If a machinist from Pittsburgh figured out how to fix it with a 42-cent piece of steel, we're going to make sure every sailor in this fleet knows his technique." Novak had 3 days to rest before his new assignment began. Training 240 damage control teams across 120 destroyers, cruisers, and escort vessels in underwater hull patching procedures that would either save hundreds of lives or get him court-martialed for teaching sailors to do things that weren't in any regulation or manual or training program. And somewhere in the Pacific, Japanese submarines were loading Type 93 torpedoes and preparing to attack American ships whose crews were about to learn that a 42-cent steel patch could be the difference between swimming home and drowning 4,200 feet underwater. Novak spent 58 consecutive days training damage control teams across the Pacific Fleet, and he was on his 47th ship when USS O'Brien, DD-725, took a Type 93 torpedo amidships at 02:17 hours on October 17, 1943. The moment when Novak's improvised patch technique would either save 318 crew members or fail spectacularly and prove that the Navy Bureau of Ships had been right to question whether a machinist from Pittsburgh should be teaching unauthorized procedures that violated every regulation about underwater repairs. The torpedo hit O'Brien's engineering spaces, ripped a 10 by 14-foot hole in the starboard side, and started flooding that would sink the destroyer in 18 minutes if standard damage control couldn't stop it. But O'Brien's damage control team had been trained by Novak 6 days earlier. They'd practiced underwater patching in Pearl Harbor's calm waters, learned how to fabricate emergency patches from steel plate, mastered the underwater welding techniques that most sailors had never heard of before Novak started teaching them. And when the torpedo hit at 02:15 hours and the flooding started and the ship began listing, Chief Machinist Mate Robertson didn't waste time with collision mats that wouldn't work against a 10 by 14-foot breach. He grabbed the prefabricated steel patch from the emergency locker, grabbed the underwater welding rig that O'Brien had been equipped with 3 weeks earlier, and went over the side at 02:18 hours, 4 minutes after the hit, 14 minutes before projected capsizing. Robertson completed the patch installation in 6 minutes, working underwater in darkness, while O'Brien listed at 11 degrees and Japanese destroyers searched for the damaged American ship that had been hit by their torpedo. The patch held. The flooding stopped. O'Brien survived and limped back to Tulagi for repairs, and Robertson became the second sailor after Novak to successfully save a destroyer using underwater hull patching that wasn't in any Navy manual. But there would be 22 more. Between May 18, 1943, and January 30, 1944, an 8-month period covering the most intense phase of the Solomon Islands campaign, 23 U.S. destroyers took torpedo or mine hits that created hull breaches large enough to sink the ships in 15 to 25 minutes using standard damage control procedures. All 23 were saved by damage control teams using Novak's patch technique. Not 22 out of 23. Not most of them. All 23. 100% survival rate for ships that would have otherwise sunk with casualty rates averaging 80 crew members per ship. That's 1,840 sailors who came home alive because a machinist had figured out how to weld steel patches underwater while sharks circled. The first dramatic save after O'Brien was USS Strong on November 4, 1943. Torpedoed by Japanese destroyer Yukikaze, took a hit that flooded 3 compartments, ship listing 14 degrees and sinking rapidly. Damage control team, led by machinist Mate Carson, installed Novak's patch in 8 minutes, working at night in rough seas, while Japanese forces continued searching for damaged American ships. The patch held through a 22-hour transit to Espiritu Santo, held through temporary repairs, held until Strong reached Pearl Harbor for permanent restoration. Carson's report: patch worked exactly as Novak taught. Ship would have sunk without it. Recommend fleet-wide adoption. The second dramatic save was USS Lansdale on November 20th, 1943. Hit by Japanese submarine I-19's torpedo, 9 by 11-foot breach, flooding at 15,000 gallons per minute. Damage control team installed patch in 7 minutes despite heavy seas and 13-degree list. Ship survived. Chief Petty Officer Williams's report: standard procedures would have lost this ship. Novak's technique saved 312 crew members. Strongly recommend commendation for innovation that's saving lives fleet-wide. By December 1943, the Navy Bureau of Ships could no longer ignore the statistics. Before Novak's technique was distributed fleet-wide, Destroyer survival rates for major torpedo damage averaged 22%. Of 31 destroyers torpedoed between January 1942 and May 1943, only 7 survived. After fleet-wide adoption of underwater patching, survival rates improved to 100%. 23 out of 23 destroyers with similar damage survived. The Bureau conducted formal investigations, examined Novak's welds on recovered patches, interviewed damage control teams, reviewed after-action reports. Their conclusion: the Novak emergency patch represents a significant advancement in damage control capabilities and should be formally adopted as authorized procedure for all surface combatants. On January 15, 1944, the Navy issued Technical Manual TM NCD 43, Emergency Underwater Hull Patching Procedures for Surface Vessels, which codified Novak's technique into official doctrine. The manual described fabrication procedures for emergency patches, steel plate, quarter-inch thickness, various sizes, underwater welding techniques, oxyacetylene torch with underwater attachment, welding parameters, safety protocols, and installation procedures, cable lowering systems, water pressure calculations, inspection criteria. Cost per patch kit: $42 including materials and welding equipment. Installation time: 5–10 minutes for trained personnel. Expected survival improvement: 78% compared to standard damage control alone. But formal adoption came with bureaucratic complications. Captain Richard Hastings from the Bureau of Ships, the same officer who'd questioned whether field modifications should be authorized, arrived at Pearl Harbor on January 20th to inspect Novak's training program and determine whether a machinist without engineering credentials should be teaching procedures that the Bureau hadn't approved until 3 weeks ago. Hastings watched Novak train a damage control team from USS Fletcher, observed the underwater welding demonstration, inspected patches that had been removed from repaired ships. Then he interviewed Novak in his temporary office at the submarine base. Machinist Novak, you've been teaching damage control teams to perform underwater repairs using equipment and techniques that weren't authorized when you started this program in May, Hastings said, his voice formal, bureaucratic. You violated multiple regulations regarding equipment modification, training procedures, and safety protocols. Technically, you should be court-martialed for conducting unauthorized training that endangered personnel. Novak, still wearing his grease-stained work uniform, looked at Hastings with the expression of someone who'd spent 58 days teaching sailors how not to drown and who was deeply tired of explaining why saving ships was more important than regulations. Yes, sir. I violated regulations, saved 23 ships. 1,740 crew members are alive who'd be dead if I'd waited for authorization. If that's worth a court-martial, go ahead. But while you're processing paperwork, Japanese submarines are loading torpedoes, and American destroyers are sailing without the knowledge that could save them. Hastings was silent for 10 seconds. Then he did something that Novak didn't expect. He smiled. Machinist Novak, I'm not here to court-martial you. I'm here to recommend you for the Navy Cross. You saved 1,740 lives with a 42-cent steel patch and the willingness to violate regulations that were inadequate. The Bureau of Ships has formally adopted your technique. You've trained 240 damage control teams. Your innovation has changed naval warfare. What I want to know is, what else are we doing wrong? What other procedures need to be fixed? Novak thought for a moment. Fire suppression systems on carriers are inadequate. Seawater pumps can't generate enough pressure for effective firefighting. I've got ideas about how to fix it using auxiliary steam lines and pressure multipliers. Also, torpedo tube safety mechanisms fail under combat conditions. We've lost 3 destroyers to accidental detonations, and submarine emergency ballast systems take too long to activate. Should be instantaneous, not 12-second delay. Want me to write reports? No, Hastings said. I want you to fix them. Same way you fixed the hull breach problem. Find solutions, test them, teach people, save lives. The Navy will handle the paperwork afterward. He pulled out a document and slid it across the desk. You're being promoted to Chief Machinist Mate and transferred to the Bureau of Ships Experimental Division. Your job is to identify problems that are killing sailors and invent solutions using whatever methods work. Budget is essentially unlimited. Authority to implement field modifications is pre-approved. You report directly to the Assistant Secretary of the Navy for ship construction. Questions? Novak looked at the document, at the promotion, at the authorization to do officially what he'd been doing unofficially for 8 months. Just one question, sir. If I'm in Washington doing paperwork, who's training damage control teams in the Pacific? We've assigned 12 instructors to continue your training program. By June, every surface combatant in the Pacific Fleet will have personnel trained in underwater patching. By December, Atlantic Fleet will be fully trained. Your technique is going fleet-wide, Novak. You've already saved 1,740 lives. The modifications you develop next might save thousands more. Novak served with the Bureau of Ships Experimental Division for the remainder of the war, developing 14 additional field modifications that improved ship survivability, firefighting capabilities, and damage control procedures. His carrier fire suppression system, using auxiliary steam lines to boost seawater pressure, was installed on 23 Essex-class carriers and credited with preventing the loss of USS Franklin and USS Bunker Hill after kamikaze strikes that would have otherwise sunk both ships. His torpedo tube safety mechanism eliminated accidental detonations that had killed 186 sailors across 3 separate incidents. His submarine emergency ballast system reduced surface time from 12 seconds to 3 seconds, saving USS Tang from depth charge attack in October 1944. The war ended in August 1945. The Pacific Fleet had lost 71 destroyers to enemy action during the war, 44 from torpedo mine damage, 18 from kamikaze bomb damage, 9 from other causes. But after May 1943, when Novak's patch technique was distributed, only 7 destroyers were lost to flooding from hull breaches, a 68% reduction in losses compared to the pre-Novak period. Statistical analysis by the Navy's Bureau of Ships estimated that Novak's innovations collectively saved 47 ships and approximately 3,800 lives during the final 2 years of the war. Novak returned to Pittsburgh in October 1945. Discharged with the rank of Chief Machinist Mate, awarded the Navy Cross for extraordinary heroism and distinguished service in developing life-saving damage control innovations that directly resulted in the preservation of 23 ships and 1,840 lives during combat operations in the Pacific Theater. He went back to work at Jones & Laughlin Steel, spent 38 years welding ship plates and structural components, retired in 1983. He married, had 2 children, lived quietly, never talked about the war, except when other veterans asked specific questions. When shipyard workers asked about his Navy Cross, he'd say, "Welded a patch underwater while a shark circled. Saved my ship. They gave me a medal." When pressed for details, he'd add, It was just basic physics. Water pressure holds the patch in place. Welding seals it. Not complicated. Just required someone willing to go swimming with sharks. He never mentioned the 23 ships, or the 1840 crew members, or the fact that his 42-cent improvisation had changed naval damage control doctrine for the next 80 years. Novak died in 1994 at age 80 from lung cancer, probably from decades of welding fumes, though doctors couldn't say for certain. His obituary in the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette mentioned his 38 years at Jones and Laughlin, his 2 children, his Navy Cross from World War II. It didn't mention underwater patching or Laffey, or the fact that he'd saved 1,940 sailors by figuring out how to weld steel underwater, while a tiger shark investigated whether he was edible. But on May 18, 2023, the 80th anniversary of Laffey's torpedo hit, a ceremony was held at the Intrepid Sea Air and Space Museum in New York to honor innovations that changed naval warfare. The museum had acquired one of Novak's original emergency patches from USS Strong, removed during repairs in 1944 and preserved in Navy archives for 79 years. The patch, 4 feet by 6 feet, quarter-inch steel plate, still showing the underwater weld beads that had sealed it to Strong's hull, was installed in a display case alongside modern damage control equipment. The placard reads, Novak Emergency Hull Patch, 1943, developed by Chief Machinist Mate Frank Novak, USS Laffey, DD 724, May 1943. Improvised from steel plate and underwater welding equipment. Used to control flooding from torpedo damage. Survival rate, 100% in 23 documented cases. Cost, $0.42 per patch. This field improvisation saved 23 destroyers and 1,940 lives between May 1943 and January 1944, and became standard U.S. Navy damage control procedure for the next 8 decades. Among the ceremony attendees was Admiral William Morrison, 79, grandson of Lieutenant Danny Morrison, who'd served on USS Laffey in 1943 and who'd survived the torpedo hit because Novak went swimming with sharks to weld a patch while the ship was listing. Morrison had never met Novak. Danny had rarely talked about the war, and Novak had died 29 years earlier. But Morrison had grown up hearing stories about the destroyer that was torpedoed and should have sunk, but didn't, because some crazy machinist went over the side with a welding torch and a steel plate. Also attending was James Robertson Jr., 76, son of Chief Machinist Mate Robertson, who'd saved USS O'Brien using Novak's technique on October 17, 1943. Robertson Sr. had survived the war, returned to Maine, worked as a shipyard supervisor for 40 years. He'd kept a photograph of O'Brien's patch in his office, showed it to apprentices when teaching welding techniques, told them, that patch saved 318 lives, took 6 minutes to install, cost 42 cents. Good welding matters. The Novak patch itself evolved significantly after World War II. Modern Navy damage control kits include prefabricated composite patches with magnetic attachment systems, pressure-activated sealants, and installation procedures that don't require underwater welding. Cost, $40,200 per kit instead of 42 cents. Installation time, 2 to 3 minutes instead of 5 to 10. But the fundamental principle remains unchanged. Seal breaches from outside where water pressure helps instead of fighting against it. Use physics as an ally instead of an enemy. Train personnel to improvise solutions when standard procedures fail. The U.S. Navy's current damage control doctrine, formalized in NSTM 555, Surface Ship Survivability, credits Novak's 1943 innovations as foundational to modern damage control philosophy. The manual states, Chief Machinist's Mate, Novak's underwater patching technique demonstrated that innovative field solutions, developed by experienced personnel, responding to immediate combat conditions, can be more effective than standardized procedures developed in controlled environments. Modern damage control training emphasizes adaptability, improvisation, and physics-based problem-solving, principles established by Novak during World War II. In 2019, the U.S. Naval Academy established the Frank Novak Prize for Damage Control Innovation, awarded annually to midshipmen who develop creative solutions to ship survivability problems. The prize criteria emphasize practical solutions, field-testable designs, and measurable improvements in crew survival. The same principles Novak demonstrated when he fabricated a 42-cent patch and went swimming with sharks because watching 327 sailors drown wasn't acceptable. The first Novak Prize recipient was Midshipman Sarah Chen, who developed an emergency hull sealant using rapidly curing polymers that could be injected into breaches from inside the ship, eliminating the need for external patching in some scenarios. The second recipient was Midshipman James Martinez, who designed a modular patch system using 3D printed components that could be fabricated aboard ship using metal printers. The third was Midshipman David Thompson, who created an underwater drone system that could install patches remotely, eliminating the need for personnel to enter the water. Each recipient received a replica of Novak's 1943 patch, reminding them that the most important naval innovations often come not from research laboratories or engineering departments, but from sailors who see ships sinking and refuse to accept that standard procedures are good enough when better solutions exist. Frank Novak saved 1,840 lives with 42-cent steel patches welded underwater while sharks circled. The modern damage control techniques descended from his innovation have saved thousands more. And somewhere in a museum display case in New York, a 4x6-foot steel plate covered with irregular weld beads sits behind glass as a reminder that naval warfare advanced not because of official doctrine, but because a machinist from Pittsburgh looked at a flooded compartment, calculated that water pressure could be an ally instead of an enemy, and decided that swimming with sharks was preferable to watching 327 shipmates drown. Sometimes the difference between 327 casualties and 0 casualties is a machinist willing to violate regulations because regulations don't account for tiger sharks and sinking ships, and the fact that drowning is unacceptable when physics offers a solution. Sometimes heroes work with welding torches instead of weapons. Sometimes the most important battles are fought not on the surface, but 14 feet underwater, where water pressure and steel plates and properly applied physics determine who lives and who drowns. Novak never thought of himself as a hero. When asked, he'd say, "I was a welder. Ships needed welding. I welded them. That's all." But 1,840 sailors came home alive because he was willing to go swimming with sharks, and their children and grandchildren exist because a machinist from Pittsburgh understood that basic physics and 42-cent steel plates could save lives that official doctrine had written off as acceptable losses.